Damn, Neo-Prog, back at it again with an outstanding album. Now, in my defense, or in its defense rather, this came out earlier this year in April, so I'm only now getting a chance to listen to it, but I am so glad I did. Let's dive into this. Emerger by Carptree. So Carptree is a neo-progressive rock group from Sweden. It's actually composed by two individuals, the lead vocalist and lyricist, Carl Westholm, and the main keyboardist, organist, main player on the keys of Nicholas Flinick, and I hope I pronounced these guys correctly. And they've been putting out quite a bit of albums since their initial release, self-titled work in 2001. They put out Superhero in 2003, Man-Made Machine in 2005, and Insect in 2007. And then finally, kind of their best received album to date since then, which is Nymph in 2010. And they've had a 7-year hiatus since then. So what can we expect after this 7-year kind of break with Emerger? And Emerger is the first work that I've heard from these guys, and I was blown away. Each time I find a new Neo-Prog album from this year, it keeps getting better and better and better, and I think this time I found the pinnacle. I found the peak of brilliance. And it happened very gradually as well. I found another Neo-Prog album that I'll be reviewing in a couple of weeks, but this one I've been listening to non-stop, and I almost had to review it just so I can move on to some of the other music that I really need to review. This guy is catchy and heavy-hitting and relentless and non-stop in the way that I expect with Neo-Prog. This reminds me of that rejuvenation that we found 10 years ago in 2007, where there was that initial shift from that very theatrical side of things to a very heavy-hitting and almost metal side of things, and that is what is present on this album. The first song of The Fleeting Deep, this really starts us all off in the right direction. And the first time I heard this, we got to the lyric of, "You can't make more time, you can't get time back." As I'm listening to this, I'm like, oh man, this is a lot of ham and cheese. Like, I don't know if I can really get on board with this. Like, what's the next line going to be? Time is a human construct or something like that? But really, it was when we got to the play out of the first song, when we come into that brilliant closing piece where it kind of grabbed me and forced me to listen to it, and I thought, okay, I'm listening now. You've got my attention. Where's this going to go from here? And that is really the spirit and the essence of this album that I love. Like, these guys are able to really compose, orchestrate, and execute a brilliant, like, symphony of noise on this. Even though there's only two guys, and they do have a number of filler individuals playing along here, but just knowing that it's just really the brainchild of two people, it just hits me even harder. And Between the Extremes and The River are a little bit more on the mellow side, which is saying something considering how heavy-hitting these guys are. But Between Extremes, this one shows that kind of almost like dark neon that the band really captures. It's like this dark light that's going on. And I love just how extreme it gets within some of that really heavy-hitting parts, but then it plays out in a very optimistic tone. And within The River, it's interesting. It feels like the spirit and the essence of what Leprous was trying to do with Molina, their latest album, but I feel like these guys did it so much better. It's got that, the first half of the song is, again, very heavy-hitting. It's a little bit more subdued in contrast to what we've had with the first two songs. These guys are able to really concentrate and hone in their skills within the creation of this, that the execution is really, like, stand out. Like, I'm blown away within this. Now we come into the fourth song, the kind of midpoint on this album, and it is by far my favorite piece on this, and that is Ultimately Lifeless. This is when I knew that I was dealing with something very, very special here. The first three songs, I was grooving away, I enjoyed myself, I was never bored. This is why I come to Neo-Prog. The passion that's behind this, the emphasis, the drive, it's all felt within this, and the song construction is just so catchy. I find myself humming away with this. The technical chops of Nicholas here is just outstanding. Like, I'm blown away by his orchestration of the soundscapes here within the organs and the synthesizers. When we come into that one by one, it almost reminds me of Who's the Boss in the Factory, like that same kind of one by one, this almost marching type of a suite. But when they say, we all fall into the machine, again, kind of like Who's the Boss in the Factory, but this is much more guttural and, like, almost, I don't know, savage-like? But it's so catchy and so meaty, I can't help but gush about it. Now, unfortunately, that is the peak. That is the high point on the album for me. The remaining 4 songs are still amazing and still really, really good, but it never meets that same high point that Ultimately Lifeless does. The follow-up track of Never to Return and Never Ever Leave, this one still has that same kind of go-getting, and this is where we hear the passion from Carl really lamenting out. And as I said, this song, as with all the other ones, has some beautiful moments on there, and just those moments to really grab onto the playout at the end with all the sounds circling around, just so good. Now, Porous is the shortest track, the 6 minute, and this one is a much needed kind of slow down. It's very somber and much more subdued than what we've already been experienced with, and it's really needed, especially with all the heavy hitting stuff. But even because it starts off somber and very quiet, it still builds into such a grand climax at the end. Similarly, Immersive Attention does the exact same thing, starting off very softly and then just growing and growing and building into just this explosion of music at the end. And the album closes off with Dwindle into Greatness, kind of this saying of, if you were king, you would be just as tyrannical as everybody else. You know, it's kind of that power corrupts ultimately everybody. And it's a good closing track, but I don't know, whenever I listen to this, I'm expecting, with everything that's kind of come before, this really grand, hard-hitting home run at the end, and I'm just kind of getting a bunt. You just kind of peter it out, like, okay, we know we've already won, so we're not going to give it the A game at the end, and I kind of feel like that's what they did with these last couple of tracks. They're still great, and they still play magnificently, and you know that they're winning the game, but it doesn't feel as, like, hard-hitting and just overall exciting as it was within those really standout beginning tracks, like The Fleeting Deep as well as Ultimately Lifeless. So there's still great and meaty parts on these tracks, but as a closing piece, I don't know, I wasn't as excited for these as I was the other stuff. Now, that just goes to show how great those other tracks are, because these final tracks, if placed on any other album, would still be probably the highlights. Now that I've been digesting this and really listening to it, it reminds me very much of, say, Big Elf. That progressive metal band from the later 2000s. They've only really put out 2 albums, Cheat the Gallows and Into the Maelstrom. I wish they put out more, because they were just a fantastic piece. Mike Portnoy was actually involved in their second album just because he loved them so much. But that same kind of theatrical metal is found on this, and it's very, like, in line with all of the greatness of Neo-Prog. So overall, I've been loving this album. I've been gushing about this album. It is such a great, great album. I have started to reach a little bit of a point of diminished returns, though, and every time I listen to it, I get a little bit less excited for it. So I hope the shelf life of this album is favorable to it, as opposed to other albums where right off the gate I felt so excited for, but then as I started listening to it, I got less and less excited for it. I really want to give this the masterpiece. I really, really do. Unfortunately, I don't think I can, just because of the little bit of a dwindling out near the end of the album, where I felt like they were running out of steam a little bit. So I'm just going to give it the next best thing, which is, obviously, I love this album with my whole heart, and I really hope with a little bit of time on the shelf, a little bit of fermentation, a little bit of maturity, I'll revisit this and I'll be able to give it that final stamp of approval that yes, this is in fact a full-on masterpiece. But that's what I think. What do you guys think of the new Carptree album? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Now that it's been out for almost half a year, let me know of your own thoughts about it by commenting down below. Definitely check this out if you haven't. It will totally and 100% get the Notes seal of approval. Thank you guys so much for watching. You guys are definitely the best. And until next time, Notes out.